Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our third event in this year's Holocaust Memorial Week. I would like to thank the other members of our planning committee, specifically Dr. Kara Ritzheimer and Dr. Catherine Hubler, and of course the longtime champion of our program, Dr. Paul Kopperman. Thank you also to Natalia Bueno for all your logistical labor. I would also like to thank all our sponsors and supporters for making this program possible again. We are very mindful of your dedication to this work. Without all of you, this would not be possible. So before we hear from our great speakers, please let me attempt to set the context for this event. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. You may have recognized a few of these lines from Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus. They are famously inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, and they describe the promise of the United States to the world. Give me your tired. It seems at this point in time we are all tired. America is tired. Europe is tired. The West is tired. Democracy is tired. We have won some of our battles, lost some others, and, like every great political and social project, we may just have run out of steam. The current mood in the world is one of resignation into the inevitable, into a new world with much fewer promises, much less hope, and much less optimism. There is no new Colossus. The old Colossus probably lies at the bottom of the harbor of Rhodes, and the new Colossus, the Statue of Liberty, still stands in New York Harbor. The statue represents not just liberty, but also the promise of democracy to raise up human rights and human dignity. It is intimately tied to the connection between the American and French revolutions, and was, as we all know, a gift by France and what one could call a testament to American soft power in the world, as it used to be. Notwithstanding all historical, political, and cultural complications, this symbolic connection between the French and American democratic projects, steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, has defined for generations what democracy, specifically American democracy, could achieve. As the Roman goddess Liberty steps over shackles and chains, she raises the torch of freedom and, together with Lazarus's poem, illustrates that for which the United States of America has been standing in the world. Emma Lazarus herself was a poet and activist, helping Jewish immigrants who were fleeing Russian persecution to come to the United States. As we are concluding Holocaust Memorial Week of 2025 today, this symbolism certainly may hold some power. And yet we seem tired. Is there something like democratic or citizen fatigue? Can political projects get tired? What happens when our political project of democracy gets tired in the democratic heartland, the so-called West? What happens when the core question of democracy, the question of, firstly, the people possessing by nature human dignity and thus popular sovereignty and thus human rights, and secondly, how these natural human rights can be the justification for the rule of the people, what happens when this core question keeps being challenged? The West has not always stood for freedom and democracy and human rights. European democracy is a rather recent phenomenon. American democracy has not always been perfect because 1776 was situated in a different world. Between 1776 and the prior fall of the Roman Republic lies circa 1,800 years of rather undemocratic rule, with a few local exceptions. The map of democracy in 1942 looks rather sparse as well. The trend after the 1990s of a surge in democracy seems to be stalling, if not reversing. The autocratic seduction is growing stronger everywhere all over the world. I realize I'm not making everybody feel better here. Democracy and human rights are tied together. You cannot believably have one without the other. Democracy also cannot exist in a vacuum. It needs a habitat to thrive in. The more democratic countries there are in the world, the safer the world is indeed for democracy, and thus for the task to preserve human life and human dignity. And even then, as we well know, we have not been perfect. But if we grow or stay tired and maybe give up on democracy, and I am not speaking only from an American perspective here, Europe is not innocent either, then we need to seriously take a good look at the alternative. I personally have seen this alternative, having grown up in the Soviet satellite state of communist East Germany. I can only say that the alternatives presenting themselves today look very similar to what I have seen in my lifetime and what my old country's predecessor, Nazi Germany, has wrought as well. This very program's mission of Holocaust Memorial Program is dedicated to the consequences of such so-called alternatives to democracy. It is dedicated to carefully investigate the political choices that can have such catastrophic consequences. We are here to remember the past and to change the future and to act in the present. When asking what the lessons are from the Holocaust, then the phrase never again frequently is brought up. This never again cannot function without democracy and human rights, and it cannot function without being global. If we care about democracy, our look needs to extend beyond our own bubble, our own country. This is why we are concluding this year's observance of Holocaust Memorial Week with a panel discussion about the global challenges to democracy and human rights. We have 3 speakers, and after that, ample time for Q&A and a time for dialogue. Please reserve your questions till the end. You may also enter them in the Q&A, which will hopefully work as intended. As to our first speaker, Dr. Mark Ward has been teaching at Oregon State University and the University of Washington. He has also been working with NGOs dedicated to humanitarian development and has served with the U.S. Department of State, with USAID, and as a senior advisor to the United Nations. His humanitarian work has focused on Asia and the Near East, including Pakistan, Russia, Afghanistan, and Syria. I am very happy that he can share his wealth of experience with us here. He is speaking today on the following topic: Neutrality Matters, the neutrality principle, where did it come from? Thank you and welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Philip. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Great. So I'm unlike the other panelists, I'm kind of an itinerant academic. I appreciate the doctor, but all I've got is a JD. But I do have decades of experience in the world, this troubling world that Philip described. God, that was depressing, Philip. I do, as Philip said, I taught last term at Oregon State, which is great. I can walk. I live in Corvallis. This term, I commute up to Seattle. I teach courses on conflict resolution and humanitarian aid, how it's supposed to work and how it does work. Yes, it's a stormy world in which we live. And yes, I do think we're all tired. Certainly donors to the humanitarian cause are tired. But I want to inject, maybe I should be speaking last, but I'm happy to go first. I want to talk about, despite the depressing world in which we live, some cause for hope and energy maybe to keep trying. So the world definitely is in crisis. Humanitarian aid has become an industry. There's no end in sight, thanks to man-made conflicts and climate change. I've never seen so much time and energy in humanitarian response around the world. And it's still something that most people can agree is a good idea, even enemies. In the diplomatic world, where conflict does break out, it's not uncommon. It certainly wasn't uncommon in my career to sort of turn to people like me with some experience in humanitarian aid and say, Mark, see if you can't find some common ground on humanitarian access or providing humanitarian aid. And perhaps that's something we could build on to find the early architecture for a peace or at least a ceasefire. Now, as you probably know, most humanitarian aid is delivered by nonprofit organizations. working in conflict zones. You see their ads all over the internet when there's an earthquake or a flood. CARE, Save the Children, Catholic Relief, they're some of the big ones. Mercy Corps is a pretty big one. Their base is in Portland. And maybe you've wondered, how is it that these nonprofits are able to deliver humanitarian aid in the middle of a conflict? How can they operate safely? Well, it's thanks to a Swiss businessman who wrote a book about the carnage of war back in the 1860s. I barely remember him. I was very young. His name was Henri Dunant. And he was in northern Italy trying to talk to, of all people, Napoleon about his own business interests. And he witnessed a battle in northern Italy between various European armies. I'm not a good historian, so I can't tell you, but it had something to do with the reunification of Italy. And he saw young soldiers dying in agony for lack of medical care on the battlefield and shortly after the battle ceased. And he decided that something should be done to relieve the suffering of soldiers wounded on the battlefield. And in a book called The Memory of Solferino, he proposed that European countries would create what he called national societies of trained nurses and doctors who could accompany their respective armies into battle and treat these wounded soldiers. They didn't have that. And he said that these societies, and this is the important part for today, he said that these societies should treat all wounded soldiers, not just their own. And be respected and given access by all belligerents. Those were bold ideas at the time. And then he went further and he said, in order to identify these people so that belligerents and foreign armies knew that these people were working for these societies trying to help the wounded, they should wear a red cross on a white background to identify them. Sound familiar? His proposal caught on and led to the creation of the Red Cross. And eventually, after 2 world wars and creation of the United Nations, the humanitarian principles that today govern the delivery of humanitarian aid were created as well. There are 4 humanitarian principles. But as Philipp said, today we're talking about one in particular, and that is the principle of neutrality. And it says, very simple, humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities. Humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities. Words on a piece of paper. Why is that important? Well, notice, number one, that it's much broader than Henri Dunant spoke of and wrote of 100 years before. It doesn't just talk about wounded soldiers. It encompasses civilians too. And it applies to humanitarian organizations. He called them, the principle calls them actors, not national societies or militaries. Practically speaking, it means that organizations delivering humanitarian aid should help everyone in need, whoever they are, and regardless of which side they're on in the conflict. And belligerents should back off and stay out of their way. Sounds like a human right to me. Let me give you a couple examples of how this works in fact from my career. So from about 2012 to 2016, I was the head of a team, the US government interagency team on the Turkish-Syrian border. And we were providing non-lethal assistance across the border to support communities that had been cut off by the Assad regime because they supported the rebels. And I remember very well, a lot of the help that we gave was humanitarian, not all of it, um, but most of it was humanitarian aid to communities that were still trying to keep their communities alive during this terrible civil war, which, as you know, went on for more than a decade. And I used to meet regularly as the head of this team with the humanitarian organizations that we were funding, principally with funding from USAID. And I remember one meeting in particular where we were talking about trauma centers that we were established. Some of these nonprofit organizations were setting up inside Syria to treat civilians who happened to be injured in the terrible barrel bombs attacks that were coming from the Syrian Air Force. And we talked a little bit about the humanitarian principles and how we would try to put them to use. And I remember a question from one of the NGO representatives that was there. He said, "Let me get this straight." I don't remember if he called me Mark or Mr. Ward or whatever. It didn't matter. They all knew me pretty well. I said, "Let me get this straight. The United States is very publicly supporting the rebel armies. But if a Syrian soldier, if one of Assad's soldiers walks into one of our trauma centers, it's okay to treat him, right?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely right." And then I couldn't help but inject a little bit of humor. I'm not sure they understood it was humor. And I said, "But go light on the anesthesia." In Afghanistan, I ran one of those nonprofit organizations after I retired. I left the Foreign Service in 2017, the first time President Trump assumed office. And this was one of the highlights of my career, running a large medical organization in Afghanistan with 400 staff, all Afghan. And we operated in the eastern provinces of Afghanistan on the Pakistan border, which, for those of you who know anything about Afghanistan, was where in those days the Taliban took refuge because they were able to cross into Pakistan when the going got too hot. And we had to negotiate very often with the Taliban in those parts of the country. Now, this, of course, is before the Taliban took over, on issues surrounding access to humanitarian aid, particularly, again, trauma care. There was a war raging. There was a civil war underway, and our trauma centers were about the only game in town for wounded belligerents and obviously civilians caught in the crossfire. And because the organization that I led had been working in that area for as long as it had, over 20 years, it was known and respected by the communities. It was known and respected by the government. It was known and respected by the Taliban. And what they knew about us was that we respected the principle of neutrality. And they knew that no matter where our trauma centers were located, and that was always a challenge, to pick the right place that was just close enough to both sides that it didn't appear to be favoring one side or the other, that a wounded combatant from either side could safely approach our clinic, be treated, and leave safely. There were occasional jerks with guns, but it was rare. And when we had a problem with a Taliban commander or a government commander who was trying to interfere with what we did, the fact that we'd been there for over 20 years usually meant that we could ask community leaders in the area who these young men would generally listen to. It might even be their father, and get them to back off. They knew us, they respected us, they trusted us. Now, a few things can mess this up. I already mentioned how important it is that the organizations delivering aid, like the one that I was running, not exhibit any sign. There can be no perception of favoritism. that comes with funding. And that's difficult, particularly where the funding comes from the United States, and the United States is so publicly aligned with one side or the other. And when the donor country insists on branding what they do, what the USAID hand clasp or that line from the American people, and every donor country has their brand. That makes it hard to convince belligerents that we really are neutral. Another thing that can go wrong is sometimes inadvertent, too much cooperation with the military. Militaries are always all too eager in their efforts to win hearts and minds with communities where a civil war is raging to associate themselves with humanitarian aid. And that can totally backfire, as you can imagine. It very quickly will convince local communities that we're not neutral at all. But in the end, what matters more than anything is action. And the fact that this organization that I led, and the fact that the organizations that were working in Syria had long experience, and their actions spoke louder than anything they might proclaim, that they in fact treated anyone that walked in the door without regard to which side they were on, and had done it for a long time, and had built trust in those communities over many, many, many cups of tea, and lots of talks, and lots of patience. They trusted us. Now, sadly, in this crazy world, some countries that you're going to hear about later in the panel who pledge to respect neutrality during a conflict don't. And I hate to point fingers, but Russia leaps to mind. In the Syria conflict, there was a very, very brave local organization in Syria called the White Helmets. And the White Helmets were what you and I would describe as very brave young first responders, truly brave, who would show up in their white helmets after the latest barrel bomb attack, very often on a medical clinic, to try to help the wounded. And then the barrel bombs would fall again. And at the time, I was in Geneva trying to negotiate humanitarian access with those same Russians. And I would publicly and privately lose it when I saw what was happening with this, we called it double dipping, the White Helmets, bombing them once and bombing them again when they show up. And hearing the Russians trying to explain this away by saying, "Oh, Mark, you just don't know. They're terrorists." Now, the US made mistakes all the time. We're very good at mistakes, but we always, at least in my experience, I shouldn't say always, we generally acknowledge them. We fess up and we apologize. And Russia never did. And many belligerents try to manipulate humanitarian aid for their own gain, to get credit for that aid, to maybe feed and treat their side alone. Another story from Syria. I generally have great respect for the World Food Program, not so much in Syria, where the Syrian regime made a deal with the UN, with WFP, that if WFP would feed Syrian communities that didn't need help, were unaffected by the war, but if WFP would feed these communities that were loyal to the regime, then the regime would let them have access to people that did need food. And WFP went along with it. And maybe that was the right decision. Pissed me off at the time. But despite these problems in implementing the neutrality principle, I am grateful to Mr. Dunant and his efforts those many years ago. In this violent world, even as imperfect as that neutrality principle. Remember, words on a piece of paper, how powerful they've become, have made fighting conflict, fighting natural disasters much easier than the situation that he saw over 100 years ago. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Dr. Christopher McKnight Nichols. For many of us at OSU, he needs little introduction, even though he has left us for the OSU, Ohio State University, where he serves as the Wayne Woodrow Hayes Chair in National Security Studies and Professor of History. He is widely taught and published in the areas of isolationism, internationalism, and globalization, as well as the role of ideas and ideologies in U.S. foreign relations. At Oregon State University, he founded and led the Citizenship and Crisis Initiative for many years. It is exciting to see you back here again, at least virtually, reminding us that our work as citizens is never done. Today, he will speak on the topic of American isolationism, unilateralism, and the West. Thank you and welcome again. And I hope you can solve all of our problems now.
I wish I could, Philip. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be part of the landmark Holocaust Memorial Week series at Oregon State, which has been such an amazing part of the community, has brought in fantastic speakers over many years, and is a sustaining part of our ways of thinking and living and trying to do better in the world. So thank you for that. My thinking today is that I will talk a bit, I'll share my screen, talk a bit about American isolationism and unilateralism in the moment in the West. Hi to all my friends there in Oregon and worldwide. And think a little bit together about the crisis of the present moment, the challenges to democracy and human rights, which is our mandate and brief for the panel, but also sort of the broader trends in which they're situated, historical and contemporary. So, we're sort of thinking about this in the U.S. context because of the skepticism that Donald Trump has placed on U.S. world leadership and a Pax Americana, what I would describe as his kind of transactional personal politics, which are unilateralist in orientation. Whether or not you want to call that isolationism could be about a definitional question. But the key elements at work here, as we were hearing from our previous speakers, are about how the Trump administration 1.0 and now 2.0 have manifested those skepticisms in actual actions, right? So pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal in his first round, now pursuing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, skepticism of NATO and the bully pulpit related to that, and the United Nations, the sorts of ways in which Donald Trump has argued that he could create better politics and policies for the U.S. by pursuing an America First agenda, often through bilateral negotiations. And this is giving him a lot of intellectual credit, which perhaps isn't necessarily due. But in trying to think through the constellation of ideas that are at work here, I think we can find some core guiding principles. So what I thought we could talk about, and Philipp's introduction was spot on to what I was thinking about, and we didn't really correspond about it. So great minds think alike, I guess, Philip. So, if you look around the world today, this is from 2024, but if you look around the world today, support for authoritarianism is high, especially in middle-income countries, as this infographic from the Pew Research Center suggests. And the open question, I think, for us is this a fatigue with democracy as we began our conversation, a kind of complacency or apathy, or what are the other indicators that are part of the constellation of what's going on here? Is it about affluence and income? This chart suggests many middle-income countries are trending in these ways, but of course so is the U.S. and so are many of the countries in Europe. As the data there suggests, 31% across 24 nations are supportive of authoritarian systems. So my sort of joking headline is about the curiosity about authoritarianism. If you look at the U.S. now, you can look at the plunging approval ratings for Donald Trump. People are not particularly happy. Anecdotally, I've taken car rides with people and had conversations with folks who were Trump voters who are now thinking, this isn't what I voted for. So that's a piece of it, this curiosity with authoritarianism, or this hope that a kind of bellicose bully pulpit presidency or leadership or far-right party could pursue the kinds of policies that would make good for the average person in a nation state may not be borne out by the reality. So that might be a generous diplomatic way of saying, beware what you wish for with the flirtations with the farther right. But at the same time, your average Democratic voter may, in fact, quickly grow tired of that, right? So a different form of fatigue, soon to be fatigue with authoritarianism, I'd like to hope. Okay, so let's think about how we got to this moment, what's going on in the US. And one of the things that has really astonished me over time has been that Americans have not been, in recent years, very interested in a world leadership role. One of the things that historians have been talking about quite a bit in recent years has been the kind of 1990s moment. This is the subtext of all three of our talks today and the opening remarks by Philipp. The 1990s moment challenged the world community broadly to figure out what a post-Cold War world would look like. And for many Americans, that meant less, not more world leadership. We're looking at this chart here from Gallup polling through the beginning of the Trump presidency, and we're down to, tied with the low point in 2011, the lowest in 25 years of Americans wanting to take a leading or major role in the world. One of the things that suggests to me, going back to, right around 9/11, is that Americans have grown unaware of the less visible and invisible ways in which the U.S. is having a large role in the world has aided them, right? And so one of the communications questions here, if you're thinking about challenges to democracy or human rights, Janine's talk and where she ended with how do we come together, how do we speak across difference, one of those real challenges, I would argue, in the present is making visible the invisible ways in which U.S. trade, U.S. foreign aid, to get back to Mark's question and point, how these actually benefit the U.S. substantively. You can easily say that ethically and morally they're right, but can you say that they're right? Can you quantify them? Can you show your average American why it's useful for their everyday life? That kind of case. I think we haven't been seeing in the American political context a good case for that made in at least 25 years. And the real challenge of that was the 1990s moment, where Bill Clinton famously, in his foreign policy, sought to create a new Clinton doctrine and wound up landing on something that they awkwardly called democratic enlargement, while trying to intervene less in the world and figure out a halting path towards humanitarianism. And as he would be the first to say, and has in fact said, that was often an ignominious path, right? That the U.S. did not take an active role in the Rwandan genocide, for instance, right? So this skepticism about the U.S.'s leadership role can have real effects, fast, demonstrative, and negative effects in world crises. How do we make visible the invisible ways in which these are helpful, right? And I would love to know what Mark has to say about that. How do you make that public case in the U.S.? How do you make that case to NATO? How do you make that case to the EU? The other piece of this is that Americans are dissatisfied with, or barely satisfied with, the U.S.'s position in the world. So how should we think about this 39% satisfied in the beginning of the Trump presidency with the position of the U.S. in the world? Is it in the Trumpian terms, the more far-right terms, that the world is laughing at the U.S. is being taken advantage of? Or is it something else, perhaps tapping into those other isolationist ideas? The U.S. isn't self-sufficient enough. There's not enough manufacturing in the U.S. The U.S., though it did better than virtually every other Western industrial country coming out of the pandemic, still had rampant inflation, which was so important in terms of the election. Again, this is another piece of the puzzle in thinking about the U.S.'s place in the world. And back to that first, political cartoon, if the U.S. is stepping back from a position in the world, even let's grant not as a leader, but how about as a partner, as a cooperative presence? If the U.S. is stepping back from that, will other nations step in, right? So here, if you're thinking about the human rights implications of the present, they're dire. And I think part of that challenge is making the case to Americans that it is at least satisfactory, if not a positive, something that they could be proud of, to have the U.S. spending, less than a tenth of its budget on aid programs to the world. Another thing to think about is just the last few years and how Americans have been thinking about their own foreign policy priorities and how those have changed. What I'd love to highlight here is how China, so Janine's presentation was ended provocatively and perhaps depressingly that we may well be in another Cold War with Russia. Americans' perception has been, and American policymakers have been preoccupied with talking about a new Cold War with China. And if you look at this, limiting the power and influence of China, the change since 2018 in terms of how Americans who are polled think about the priorities for the U.S., it's been up 17%, the highest by far of any of the categories on the Pew Research Center polls about this. And then, disturbingly, in terms of our topic for today, in terms of democracy and human rights, there at the bottom, is aiding refugees fleeing violence around the world. So some of the open questions there for us, and then you can look at a number of other ones here to consider what you think to be the most important questions. But for me, looking at combining the two, that the Americans are preoccupied with the power and influence of China, and in some ways could care less about or care far less about it as a general principle, aiding refugees. I think that helps us to cluster our ideas about the skepticism about NATO, about the UN, and a host of other topics. One other thing I wanted to say to this group as we think about this, and when I talk to students and when I've done public talks about this sort of stuff, is that young adults in the US are some of the ones who are the most disillusioned. This has come as a surprise to me. I don't know if it does to others, and we could talk about this in our Q&A, that young adults are far less likely than older adults to say the U.S. should play an active role in world affairs. It used to be some time ago, we would have conversations about this because there was disillusionment about the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Those are now long over, effectively, for the younger generations, and yet we're still seeing this element. To what extent do young Americans locate this sort of skepticism about the U.S. playing an active role in the world in terms of the lack of benefits that they see from that world position? So, I was speculating a bit about the economic dimensions, but what about other ones? How else can we better understand this generational divide? And is it likely to endure? So we can just plant that seed for the time being. This one will not surprise anyone at all. If you're thinking about which sort of institutional party affiliations in the U.S. Lean towards wanting the U.S. to be involved in the world, to have benefits from world engagement, and especially working with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It won't shock you to see that Democrats are much more firmly in that camp. So as you go back a little bit, as we go back to 2016, as a scholar of isolationism and in doing events and talks in the Citizenship and Crisis series that I helped to lead at Oregon State, it didn't surprise me that in 2016, Americans who were saying that the U.S. should deal with its own problems and let others deal with theirs the best they can were much more likely to be voting for Donald Trump, right? And one of the things that I've located here in terms of the broader U.S. intellectual tradition is that this is an enduring principle in American public life. It's not an aberration. It has been there from the start. And so if you're thinking about these challenges to democracy in the present moment, the minding your own business at home doesn't necessarily mean diminishing democracy, although we are seeing that today. But minding your own business at home, I think, does come with clear ramifications for the U.S. playing a role in the world in terms of conflict prevention, aid programs, human rights, even sort of what the Clinton era folks would talk about in terms of democratic enlargement or free trade, a whole host of other ways that the U.S. can play an advocacy role in the world. And again, this longer trajectory is one I think we should point to in understanding our current moment, that these, as Janine was suggesting, these aren't new. These patterns have been here for a while, and for that reason, we really need to take some time to contemplate those broader traditions. So, in what remains of my time, I thought I'd quickly encapsulate some of this tradition to think together with you all about unilateralism, and then kind of conclude with the West. So in the American political tradition, it was surprising to me and to others that we would have Donald Trump and the Republicans embrace a sort of isolationist form of America first, because that had been effectively tarred and feathered with the America First Committee in 1940, right? It is shocking in 2025 to hear the accusations from America Firsters of anti-Semitism against other peoples and groups, right? A group that was effectively tarred as anti-Semitic with the statements of people like Charles Lindbergh and others. But if you look at that back in a longer tradition, from Washington there on the left, neutrality to unilateralism in the case of someone like Thomas Jefferson, to non-intervention in the case of James Madison, Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. One of the things you can think about as American policy tradition that helps inform our present moment is that throughout most U.S. history, Americans and American policymakers have been reluctant to be involved in collective security agreements with other countries like NATO. That was only the second ever binding collective security treaty that the U.S. signed in 1949, and the first was in 1778 with France to win the Revolutionary War. So too, the sort of unilateralist bent in American foreign policy may be the most default setting orientation of foreign relations that we can see. And so, when we hear people argue, as to some extent we got in the neutrality comments of Mark, that is possible and easy for some nation states, and the U.S. has long adhered to neutrality in foreign conflicts. It's only in the recent past that the U.S. hasn't traveled that path. The neutrality arguments for the U.S., though, have often verged on non-intervention. That Monroe Doctrine piece have often made Americans less interested in being involved. And there's a long history that we can't possibly get into in this talk or even in Q&A about that people around the world coming to the U.S. asking for American aid or even just moral sustenance and being rejected. And it seems to me that we're in a much closer to that 19th century model today than we've seen the U.S. in the last 75 years at least. But if you're thinking about this sort of the America First precursors and what that moment in 1940 might tell us a bit about our current time. The National Endowment for the Humanities just put out a call for people to propose new statues for the statuary garden of American idols. That's what is replacing. That's what the Donald Trump vision of a triumphalist the U.S. would be, and that's what's replacing the NEH's normal grant giving. Tragically, there you see the Defend America First and the icon of George Washington. It was a vigorously anti-FDR, anti-New Deal set of programs. But really, the America First Committee had one and only one policy position. It never endorsed party candidates. And its one position was to stay out of World War II. And it was deeply informed by the lessons of World War I. And we could get into that more. But the key here that I think is worth noting here is for them, it was about neutrality. And this taps into Mark's point. For them, it was about not being engaged. So Mark's orientation towards aid programs through state governments and in terms of international non-governmental organizations is spot on right, except that the America First default setting of neutrality is one that would have the U.S. not be involved at all. Right. So that's a huge challenge at the intersection of democracy and human rights. And it stems back to at least this America First moment, which is why I wanted to mention it in this talk. And then if you're thinking about this time, and since I'm throwing up slides and we're talking together, I can't help but have a Dr. Seuss slide up because these are great. And this over there, you have the isolationist, said a whale. There's so much commotion, such fights among fish in the ocean. I'm saving my scalp, living high on an Alp. Dear Lindy, he gave me the notion that a retreat from the world piece, right? And what's interesting about our contemporary moment in sort of Trumpian foreign policy is the return to protectionism, the return to this kind of hagiography of the Gilded Age and Progressive era, this idea that the McKinley tariff in 1890 somehow made the U.S. Incredibly wealthy, which is absolutely wrong. You can look at historical abstracts of economic data. The average standard of living, the average wage was practically flat throughout that whole era. Yes, large fortunes were made in an era of unregulated capitalism, but you had cyclic economic downturns. Virtually all of the highest protective trade tariffs backfired on the U.S. economically. This was not an era of that. But if you combine that with the isolationist piece, I think you do see something important, a kind of attempt to build up a walled and bounded position for the U.S. This is something that in the American isolationist tradition, most politicians have rejected. They've often said, look, there's no way the U.S. could be less engaged with the world. If the goal is to limit the U.S.'s engagements, where should the U.S. strategically be engaged? And I think for the first time in a long time, we're seeing a kind of protectionist isolationism in the U.S. that would limit virtually every form of engagement with the world. And that's new. Even in early Cold War, Republican isolationists like Robert Taft didn't argue for that. In the 1920s and 1930s, some of the arch isolationists didn't argue for that either. So this is a return to a kind of 19th century model that we haven't seen, haven't thought much about. All right, to push us towards closing, maybe there's a bit of optimism. Some of these isolationist arguments, some of the politics of turning inward and being unilateral have often backfired, as I suggested at the outset. This is the image that went with the New York Times piece by Adlai Stevenson, two-time candidate for president of the Democratic Party, talking about the challenge of a new isolationism in the early Cold War. This is 1949 as they're debating and passing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And why I wanted to bring this up here, as you see, I've used this in several different talks over the years, the eagle, not the ostrich, is the nation's best symbol. That many Americans do really believe in this. The cover of The Economist lately just said, 1,300 plus days left, and had this battered image of an eagle. Americans like this kind of transcendent imagery, and to the extent to which you can see a backlash already coming to these sort of isolationist, protectionist policies of the Trump administration. This is the sort of thing that one can maybe hang your hat on and be happier about. All right, so final bit in thinking about the West. This was my brief from Philipp, and I'm going to do what I pledged to do, which is to say, how does this fit with broader European Union, Europe, tariff policy, spending, conflicts? That could be a conversation for a whole nother day. But if you're thinking about sort of the bully pulpit of Donald Trump from his first administration until now, the ways in which the tariffs have been implemented and what countries were paying them, and who and what were giving the most aid to Ukraine. One of the things that is absolutely empirically true, oddly enough, and probably backfiring on Donald Trump, is that his tariffs are bringing the EU together. And the same is true to a significant extent in Asia. You're seeing blocks of different groups come together to oppose the U.S. The same is true, empirically true, with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. This is a 2024 map, and they've already increased spending since that. You're looking at NATO countries starting to move forward with more joint operations outside of the U.S., more independent purchases of military equipment made in the EU, all of which is in decreasing reliance on the U.S., which is a really salient issue if you're thinking about who and what will fill the gap as the U.S. recedes from a leadership role in the world, which is where I started. Also, really important to note how much the EU has been part of funding the war in Ukraine. It's going to be incredibly hard to support the war in Ukraine as the U.S. Continues to pull away from that. But it is important to note that Donald Trump and the sort of far right in the U.S. are wrong that the U.S. has been the country bearing the most burden here, right? And this is another way in which you can see the European Union countries and simply the neighbors around Ukraine coming together to think through these problems. So in some ways, the backfire that Putin had here, pushing countries into NATO, right? His hope, the politicizing of the war in Ukraine was about NATO expansion. In fact, the countries have gone into NATO. So too, the backfire to Donald Trump's tariff policies, spending, and politicizing the war in Ukraine have brought other countries together. So it's worth thinking about those as a set of connections. And finally, if you're rethinking America's role in this moment, what does it look like? Well, in the policy community, what people talk about is managing decline, right? So how do you manage decline in the U.S. And I think this is the point for our panel today, how do you manage U.S. decline and still adhere to democratic norms within the country, which we've seen eroded dramatically and radically, and pursue meaningful human rights, international organization, and multilateral cooperation in the world system. It's very clear that Donald Trump's politics and the Republican Party today don't necessarily buy into that vision, and that Americans are skeptical. So if you're rethinking the U.S.'s role, is it possible through some of what Mark was saying and what Janine was saying, are there collectivities that could sort of bring new support to some of those kinds of positions? Are there meaningful ways or historical insights for us to consider how to make visible, as I said earlier, the invisible benefits of U.S. world leadership, or in the very least, U.S. world engagement? I will leave it at that for now. Thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all the panelists and our audience and all the organizers. Thank you. Goodbye.